welcome you all here. My name is Susan Crabtree. I'm a RealClearPolitics reporter. I'm a national reporter, former White House reporter, covered Congress for too long, over 20 years. Now covering religious freedom. We have a series we're doing on that topic with a special emphasis. And I am just honored to be here with Nury Turkel. We are celebrating his book, No Escape. It is quite the gripping and moving tale of the Uyghur genocide, what's going on in China. And we all know what has been happening. All of us in this room care deeply about this topic. But if you read the story, it gives it more of a personal tale than we have maybe have heard before. Some of you might be aware of it. I was just incredibly moved by the powerful stories in No Escape. Nury, probably for many of you, he doesn't need an introduction, but for those of you who aren't as familiar with his background, he is a US educated Uyghur American lawyer, foreign policy expert, human rights advocate. He was born in a re-education camp in the height of China's tumultuous Cultural Revolution, and he spent the first several months of his life in detention with his mother. His mother came from an influential family. Her father had been an important official in the Ministry of Culture in the Second East Turkestan Republic. His father was from a town in the north near the border with Kazakhstan. It's a more European part of the country where the Soviet influence had taken greater hold than in the more conservative and religious south where his mother was from. He was the son of his father was the son of a famous Uyghur dancer who was known across the country the way a celebrated tango dancer might be known in Argentina, and I'm taking that from the book. Even though he too was a good dancer, his father took a more practical route and became a math teacher. Their parents met at a university dance, and then they married. They had dreams of raising a family, much like many of our mothers and fathers. But those dreams were cut short when Nury's mother, who was pregnant with him at the time, was sent to a re-education camp. Her crime? She opened the door to too many of her father's friends. And they were friends from the short days of the East Turkestan's independence, and those contacts that he still kept in touch with. So when Nury and his mother emerged finally from the re-education camp, they were both malnourished and a little shell-shocked. But Nury persevered, and he became a very dedicated student. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1999, 89, we are almost the same age. So we have, I remember that time very well. He thought it might be prompt a better climate for sort of an autonomous climate where they could once again gain independence from China. But after the crackdown on Tiananmen Square, Nury became discouraged and he looked for a way to the United States. He studied English every day and finally passed the TOEFL exam, which was required for students who wanted to apply for college. He came to the United States in 1995 and was later granted asylum by the US government. But as we know, that was quite long ago. Nury has ascended since then to become the chair of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. He was appointed by Speaker Nancy Pelosi in 2022 for a 2-year term. And in September 2020, he was named one of Time's magazine's most influential people in the world. And in May 2021, he was named Fortune list of the world's 50 greatest leaders. In that time period, he founded his own charity. He helped many Uyghurs get out of the country and into safety. Truly, truly remarkable life and experiences. And the No Escape, the book, captures so much of this. I would highly encourage you to pick it up and read it. It's just one of the most amazing tales I have read of personal suffering and heroism on the part of these strong people who managed to persevere and during unthinkable persecution and genocide, and we should call it by its rightful name. So Nury would like this to be more of a casual conversation, a fireside chat type of forum. So I wanted to talk to him about why he named the book No Escape, because there are some people who he helped escape. So what is the point you're trying to make there?
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for coming here all the way from San Diego to have a conversation with me about my life and my work. Before we begin, I'd like to express my gratitude to my colleagues at Hudson Institute, the leadership, John Walters specifically, for the ongoing efforts to shine a spotlight. Even before I joined Hudson, this institution, this think tank has been organizing events. This goes way back 5-6 years, so I'm very grateful. I also wanted to recognize my friends who are in the audience, European MEP Ilhan Küçük here with us, also Ambassador Nathan Sale, my good friend Peter, and my colleagues from the UHRP. Thank you all for being here. I chose this name for a very specific reason. As you noted, I came here as an immigrant student initially. I'm a US citizen and serving the US government, and I should not feel or experience persecution from communist China. I don't feel that I have been fully escaped to China's persecution. As we speak, my mother is still in China. I haven't seen her since 2004. And I've been retaliated against by the Chinese government and sanctioned last December. So I have not been fully free, even though I'm physically free and working and living in a nation's capital. And the other reason is more to the general public. When you talk about human rights in China, oftentimes, specifically in the policy circle or with the ordinary people, they feel like, oh, this is another human rights atrocities. We're too busy, too remote, too distant. We might as well mind our business. But the Uyghur genocide, Uyghur crisis is none of those typical human rights abuses. It relates to every aspect of American life, I think it's fair to say, whether it be economic interests, values, global leadership, and now the technological competition. So the general public can no longer say that they either they did not know or they can't care, or they can say that I'm able to escape this reality, or dealing with this brutal regime in Beijing. So the name of the book, No Escape, seems very simple, but it has both personal and societal meaning. That's one of my ultimate goals, to make this relatable to ordinary people, policy makers, that this is just not something that, as China describes, in the context of security, or the business leaders saying this is something that they can ignore because there's so much stake in economic. There's a real human tragedy. There's a serious human aspect to it. So that's the reason that, I know it's a long answer, but.
No. If you read the book, you do, I think as Americans, we want to care about this. I don't think enough Americans know about it. As you mentioned, not enough Chinese know about it or know the whole atrocities that are going on behind these closed doors in these re-education and labor camps. But I thought of like Anne Frank's diary when I was reading the stories of the persecution of these women. And you have, we could sort of relate to that because it's not something far away anymore. It's a personal life that we can understand. Somebody hiding, being secreted away for so many years and having to live their life in fear all the time. But with this story, you mentioned several Uyghur women and their fear, but also their experiences in the camps themselves, which are just unthinkable. And those include Zamrat Dawat, helping with the names.
Dawut,
and Miracle Tursun.
Yes.
And these women have managed to get out, but they too have not escaped the persecution, the long arm of the Chinese government, and they suffer to this day. I would like to talk to you a little bit about their experiences and how you got them out, helped get them out.
The Chinese government's targeted attack on the Uyghur women, Uyghur children, has been something ongoing. The Uyghur Human Rights Project published a report on the Chinese-only language policy several years ago. It was very comprehensive. It was even published the updated version, but the world did not pay much attention to it. There was so much early warning sign. That was the government's initial targeted attack on the Uyghur children through this educational process to create a new generation of Uyghurs who may not look exactly like a Han Chinese, but their thinking, their behaviors, their preference in life, even marriage, sending Uyghur kids to inland schools. Mihirgul Tursun that you mentioned is one of those students who ended up being in the camp and survived it luckily. She lives around the Washington area. The other issue that you also mentioned, which I spent a lot of time describing, is Chinese government's targeted attack on the Uyghur woman. The Uyghur woman always been perceived as some sort of sexual object in the Chinese society. But the brutal method, forced abortion, late-term abortion, sterilization, reached the new level, even based on the Chinese government's own publicly available information. The birth rate, natural birth growth of Uyghur population plummeted significantly. We're talking about more than 60% in just 1 year. It's a staggering, and this is one of the reasons that the United States government compelled to call it genocide. Ambassador Sales can tell you more about it after the discussion, but it was an uphill battle even for the officials within the State Department in the previous administration. So even to this day, it's mind-boggling that some governments, including those in liberal democracies, still don't feel comfortable to call it a genocide. It is the Chinese acts, intentions, and the ongoing persecution meets several key definitions, legal definitions of the genocide. So, and also when you look at the ongoing targeted attack on the Uyghurs, that child separation, now it's becoming a genocide of the Uyghur children. They have, based on New York Times reporting, at least 800,000 Uyghur children have been forcibly removed. And some of those parents who lost their children or whose children disappeared recognized their kids in a TikTok video, promotional videos. Several of them testified publicly. One of them testified in the Uyghur tribunal in the UK, led by former prosecutor Sir Jeffrey Nice. So this has been it's a wholesale or systematic attack on the Uyghur population to debase, not only debase, but also to destroy the entire Uyghur nation.
So we talked a little bit about this earlier, you and I, but why is China so fearful of religion in general? I recently wrote a story about red flags for Hong Kong on religious freedom and the efforts to try to influence the Catholic bishops there, synodization of the Catholic bishops there and their schools, infiltrate the schools. What is it about religion that bothers them so much?
China's domestic and foreign policy essentially centering around two aspects. One is anything that entangles or encircles, specifically what they call the Western influence. The other is anything that slows down the development. On the first one, actually both of those concerns involves Uyghurs. On the first one, it goes essentially in the idea or the perception that Western religion, or foreign religion, including Islam and Christianity, are not compatible with communist ideology. So it will create more resentment. It will pose a long-term threat. It could be a source for future unrest. The stability is a paramount concern to the CCP. So at any cost, under any justification, if anything that are not compatible with the CCP or communist ideology, or anything that could potentially pose a political threat or create instability, that need to be taken out. How are they accomplishing these goals? They're focusing two things. One, integrating all of these concerns into national security. So anything that poses a threat to the state can be considered a national security threat. This is part of the reason that they securitize, beefed up the police. Arguably, the Uyghur homeland is the most secure place today in China. And also the other way that they're accomplishing that goal is to take out any thought virus. They liken religious practices, religious belief to thought virus. They even use terms such as, in order to take out weeds one by one, it can be very ineffective, you have to spray chemical. So they treat people who practice religious practices, people who are suffering mental illness. So they have taken actions to preemptively locking up and religious leaders, thought leaders, the custodians of cultural heritage, to force them to go through this human reengineering they call re-education process.
Mm-hmm. And I know we talked about how the re-education camps and the labor camps are so similar to what happened during the Holocaust in Germany. Can you describe that, that uncanny resemblance? And can you describe the cultural sort of eradication that they're engaged in as well?
Forced labor practice is also not something new. I grew up seeing people being subject to slave labor. And interestingly, oddly enough, that the same organization, Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, the acronym is XPCC, which is essentially a paramilitary with over millions of paramilitary troops that have been enslaving Uyghurs in cotton field, irrigation system constructions, as I grew up in my ancestral hometown, Kashgar. I've written about this in an op-ed last year. So the practice was there, but it got into the level of industrial scale, in a global scale in the last several years. Some people in the United States, around the world, including the UN Secretary General just a couple of days ago, essentially repeating the Chinese propaganda, which is China were able to get millions of people out of poverty. But the question should be at what cost? So they may have elevated millions of people out of poverty, at the same time they created labor shortage. So who's going to make those cheap products that we consumers addicted to here at home and Europe, around the world? So the Chinese use this political economy to solve their political concerns, and also maintaining the assembly lines was still operated with the enslaved Uyghur people. And also the forced labor practices on a historical perspective, as I noted in the book, was a very similar method as the Nazi regime used. If you look at the history, the Dachau was built by a Jewish woman. So it is a very similar. Just over the weekend, myself and my UHRP colleagues were in Los Angeles. We visited the Museum of Tolerance. As we walked through, we noticed striking similarities, including the way that Chinese Communist Party used the intellectuals, academics, to formulate policies. They call it final solution to the Xinjiang problem. Sounded very similar. Just example, in Wannsee Conference in 1942, Hitler brought in 16 high-level Nazi officials. 8 of them have PhDs. So even Adolf Eichmann wanted to make sure that the final solution idea must be endorsed. And similarly, if you look back, the way that today's nightmare come to an existence, essentially was promoted by Chinese academics. And one of them, one of the Chinese experts, Zhou Hailun, some people liken him to Adolf Eichmann, is an Uyghur expert. He studied the weaknesses and strengths, even the languages I profiled in the book. One of the Uyghurs that I interviewed, Abdulwili Ayub, used to be his translator. He was cruising around in Kashgar in a fancy SUV with his German Shepherd dog. It's a very similar, scary scene, strikingly similar.
And the other thing I found pretty compelling about the book was all the research that was done on eradicating the mosques, and what went into their place. There was a push for redevelopment, but it was not always redeveloped. There were many, and the researcher Zenz, he painstakingly, if you read the book, goes through and uses Google Earth to look and see how many mosques have been bulldozed or diminished in some way, and it's thousands. Like he documented, what was it, 2,000 out of 4,000. It was almost half, and to me, it's just striking that sometimes you were talking about how they develop theme parks in some of them, parking lots. We also discussed that there were cemeteries, that some of even the prisoners that we mentioned before had to get their bones of their loved ones and take them home to inter somewhere else because they were bulldozing over the cemeteries. They're just trying to wipe the culture off of the area and diminish this people. So I want to just ask you too about how they go about doing this and how Silicon Valley's technology they've usurped for this end.
The Uyghur cemeteries, Uyghur cultural centers are located in the city and vicinity. Because of this booming housing development, shopping malls and apartments being built in traditional Uyghur areas, neighborhoods, specifically in Kashgar, the local authorities essentially forcing the local residents to move out of the city and vacate the city center. That also included some old cemeteries. A few years ago, Uyghur Human Rights Project published a report where we had a late columnist for the Washington Post, Fred Hyatt, was in present, and he wrote, after listening to the discussion, he wrote a column called "Liking What Uyghurs Experiencing as the Everyday in Kristallnacht." So specific targeted cultural erasure. Not only that the government destroying and creating a kind of a collective cemetery in a designated place, they're also allowing some businesses to build a hotel, for example, in the case of Hilton. This was also reported. So there's a business complicity. There's a very specific targeted attempt to destroy Uyghur culture. Again, anything that remains or allows Uyghur to be Uyghur is something that can be perceived as a threat by the Chinese government. And as for the technology, when the previous administration sounded alarm, designating several Chinese high-tech companies to the entity list, the public response was, oh, this is part of the political or geopolitical strategy of the United States government, but they're missing the point that this is something part of China's attempt to blunt and build their influence around the world. So the technological advancement, the surveillance is part of China's influence operations. If you look at today's Europe, Africa, Central Asia, the Chinese technological tools, equipment, and means are very popular. Huawei, for example, brags about having a contract, cloud storage contract with over 140 countries. And the Chinese surveillance system, based on various reports, have been already adopted more than 80 countries. That includes Germany. when you dig through why would they need this technology that can justify saying for societal safety. In some instances, they use the sewage system safety as an excuse, but some responsible government may use it for responsible, reasonable reasons. But we cannot say the same thing about the authoritarian regime. And in the case of ZTE, they're bragging about their capability to develop, this is actually gaining traction in various countries, a street lamp light that has motion detector with a camera. That's a music to some authoritarian regime. So the Chinese surveillance techniques in the long term and short term should be perceived as a threat to civil liberties and democratic system. In the bare minimum, those surveillance techniques can allow authoritarian regimes to even monitor election process, their opponents' public activities, internal communications. So when somebody says that we have a serious threat from China in the technological sphere, it's not an exaggeration. Actually, it's an understatement. We might be even late in tackling this serious issue. And also something also need to be brought up here. None of those technological Chinese high-tech firms are private. There's no such a thing. The Chinese states own it. Chinese state owns the technology. They own the structure. There are reportedly more than 2,000 red phones in China. Based on this book that I reference in my book, by K. Street Matter, who wrote a book called "We Haven't Harmonized," a German scholar, journalist who spent 20 years studying that subject, essentially said that each and every one of the high-tech firms has a red phone directly connected to the central party leadership. So anyone, anytime from the central government can find and direct those tech firms, CEOs and presidents to act in a certain way. And they also, I recently talked to somebody who's very familiar with the Chinese system, specifically in the economic trade area. They even tell the business owners, "You don't own this business, we own it." So that's how it is set up. So people should not be naive or short-sighted about the Chinese high-tech capabilities as well as the government's influence in its operations.
I think one thing that I didn't really understand before I read the book was that we didn't understand the surveillance, how detailed the surveillance is. They encourage Uyghurs they give phones. The Communist Party government gives phones to the Uyghurs that they use and that they're mandated to have on them all the time, that they use to track every detail of their life, every text, and they use AI to go through and highlight different words. They don't even allow Tiananmen Square to be on Tiananmen to be used in text on some of their applications, but they track it. So you could be caught up in this dragnet if you what did you mention in the book? Buy too much alcohol one week, and maybe you're having a party or something. Even to that level of detail, they can monitor your bank accounts, who you're contacting, every phone conversation. So people start just basically censoring themselves. So they live under this fear, even if they haven't been taken to a re-education camp, they live under constant fear of having that happen to them. So it's really just a repressive mechanism. But I wanted to talk about, you also mentioned the brain control devices that we banned recently as part of our effort to fight back.
The use of technology, again, has been one of the methods that they built this database. In 2015, starting 2015, the Uyghurs, maybe even earlier, this app called WeChat became so popular. Even the Uyghurs in the United States were using that app. So nothing like WeChat has been invented yet. It's a combination of everything. You can we can essentially call it the combination of eBay, Amazon, PayPal, all the apps for communication. So that allowed the Chinese government to build this massive database. Even one of the AI experts who appeared in the same documentary as I did, The Age of AI, said something people should remember. Today's China is the new Saudi Arabia for personal data. So that they collected this personal data, purchase history. For example, the company Taobao, built and owned by Alibaba, shared the purchase history with the Chinese government. That includes what kind of material that they purchased through WeChat. That includes prayer mat. And then essentially, it's starting in 2017, they used this platform called the IJOP, Integrated Joint Operating Platform, that the Human Rights Watch reverse engineered to unleash, as I noted in the book, in 10 days alone in 2017. So this platform ordered the police to round up 20,000 people in just one village. The local police could not, I started the book with that exchange actually, they could not find 20,000 people. So they squeezing around and find 17,000 people and they're gone. And no one asked them if this was a way to do it, if those people committed any crime. So that's how random the initial roundup was. And then, and the mobile device scanning, even some people tried to stop using smartphone and switch to dumb phone. That also been noticed by the authorities. So when you stop and asked to give you a phone for data scanning, and the phone is not smartphone, the question follows why you're not using a smartphone. So because of that, thousands of Uyghurs around the world, even to this day, cannot communicate with their family members. Because family members, including my own then, says don't contact. So if you have any communications record, history, browsing caches, if it gets caught, that could result in possibly sent to the camp. So it initially started with, and even some Silicon Valley companies, namely Zappio, who designed this religious material sharing app, was used by the Chinese, initially encouraging people to use it. It was permitted. And then they used the history of download history from that specific app to round it up thousands, if not millions, of religious practitioners or pious Muslims.
We cannot relate to that in the United States, but we need to know that it's insidious even here, because if we are using some of those apps, we are providing personal information to the Chinese government. Recently, all of Washington was captivated by Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan.
Yeah.
And I know you recently went there.
Yeah.
Tell us about that trip and what you're so concerned about that may happen in Taiwan.
Well, before I comment on that question, I'd like to mention that this is something that should be talked about on a regular basis, but it didn't get much attention. Last December, the United States government added a Chinese military medical academy and its 11 affiliates to the entity list, which is an export ban design implemented by the Commerce Department. Why would the Chinese government develop a brain control weaponry? That was a specific. It's already been developed. That what that entity list designation does is to prevent U.S. companies to provide software or technological support. So that in of itself shows how much the technology has been misused by the communist Chinese regime. Technology should make our lives better, foster human rights to the extent. And yet the progress that the Chinese government brags about pretty much every day has not been a moral progress. It has been a disastrous progress. We still remember Hitler conducted biomedical research on the Jewish people, but today we're dealing with a regime that the international community is still doing business with, kowtowing to the extent, has already developed brain control weaponry to be used against vulnerable ethno-religious groups such as the Uyghurs. So this weapon, based on my own research, essentially controls your behavior with the thought process. It's already been there. And this is in addition to the mysterious pills that I was told that the Uyghur women were forced to take in the camps that control their body functions, emotions. So there's some sort of medical experiment, disturbingly, has already been underway and been implemented based on those reports.
And we also have the DNA issue. Recently, in the last few years, as you all know, the Senate did an investigation and found that the Chinese were infiltrating our universities and stealing our technology. But what we didn't know, I didn't know until I read this, is that they were even using our own DNA tech. They were using our professors to do research on Uyghur DNA. Tell us about that.
The company, Thermo Fisher Scientific, Massachusetts-based company, was exposed by my colleagues from the CECC, the Congressional Executive Commission on China. And the same sequencer was in the use for a long time, and they claimed that they stopped using it, was selling it to Xinjiang police, but the other region, other provinces can purchase and still use it. So it's a window dressing. One of the American scientists at the Yale Medical School brought in a Chinese government scientist who believed to be employed by the Minister of Public Security to conduct research on Uyghur DNA at the Yale Medical School under the supervision of Professor Kitts. On Taiwan, I've been going to Taiwan for a number of years now, starting from my initial law practice representing a Taiwanese airline. But most recent trip, I would say, is the most meaningful, to an extent, impactful trip. I was invited to go and give a keynote speech at a religious freedom conference. That, to me, is a remarkable conference. Taiwan does not have a religious freedom problem, for the most part. No, but they have been playing a very active role, like other members of the democratic societies or community of democracies. This is the second time that I attended the similar type of conference. So it's very risky on a personal level. In light of the sensitivity, I decided to go for two reasons. One, I wanted to share with the Taiwanese people what this regime in Beijing is capable of. I wanted to strike a very simple message that the Taiwanese people must study the Uyghur genocide. When Chinese would start committing acts of genocide, the world looked the other way. When the Chinese destroyed Hong Kong democracy, similar attitude. And now the Taiwan is facing this security threat, existential threat. People still not taking it seriously. And I also wanted to share my personal experience to sound alarm, if I could, what really re-education means. The Chinese ambassador to France said that the Taiwanese people need to be re-educated. The Uyghur people know what re-education means. Hong Kong people know what re-education means. The former governor of Hong Kong blamed the protesters who demanding democratic freedom, essentially saying that they are not well educated. So that education in of itself is a very problematic term. And I want Taiwanese people to hear it from me. Because I was born in a re-education camp. I spent first several months of my life in a re-education camp. Re-education means re-engineering, human re-engineering. They will force you to study communist ideology. They will force you to give up your way of life, your religious belief. And also you need to be able to adopt Xi Jinping thought as your religion. So that need to be told by somebody like myself who had seen both sides. So it was very important. I also wanted to show solidarity with the Taiwanese people, and told them, even in my personal professional capacity, it's very important. And the other communities lended their voice to the Uyghur people during this difficult time. So Taiwanese people deserve all the support: military, societal, governmental, individual.
And you have a whole chapter dedicated to what we're doing to fight back. And as a journalist, that's sort of where I'm most interested in, are the things that we're doing. We did at the end of the Pompeo, at the end of the Trump administration, under Secretary Pompeo, there was a big push to declare it genocide. I know Secretary Pompeo took it very seriously. I know there are people in this room that were instrumental in that decision. It was the very end of the administration. We didn't know if the Biden administration was going to agree, and they have. So, what does that carry? That means that you have to actually, as a country, we have to do something about it now. We're obligated by law to act. We passed the Congress, and President Biden last December signed into law the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Yeah.
How is that going? How is it working?
First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my good friend, Ambassador Kelly Curry and Ambassador Nathan Sells, who were at the State Department and not only supporting, leading the effort to give this crime a proper name. And also, I also wanted to thank my CECC colleagues, Scott especially over there, and former co-director of the CECC, for spearheading all the legislative initiatives. And I can't imagine that we will have even today's this law that you're referencing without their effort. And I can't imagine that the international community would have been able to at least continue some of the policy initiatives implemented by the previous administration. It was not for those wonderful officials, leaders who give this crime a proper name. How it's going. This genocide, disturbingly, it's in 6th year. Genocide should not continue. When the governments call it a genocide, a strong action must be followed, stopped, and hold those perpetrators to account. That has not been done yet. There are over 150 state parties to the Genocide Convention. Under the Genocide Convention, Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, the state parties must call it, stop it, and punish. None of that has happened yet. Only 9 state parties, including the United States, have called it out. But the rest of the world still has not been really joined this effort led by the United States. It's a bipartisan, the Congress, the administration, previous and current administration. We need to, and we also need to, it's not working, I think for 3 reasons. One, our European allies, I'm not speaking, you've been doing what you can do past several years, but most of the European countries are still not really getting this, taking this concern, threat seriously. So the allies and partners and allies are not really on the same page. They're still in a slow motion. That's one problem. The second problem is the business community. I think the biggest, if I may use the term, enemy in this fight is the business community, global, domestic. During the process of legislating the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce publicly opposed to it. And several companies, as reported in the New York Times, lobbied against this bill, including the companies Nike, Coca-Cola, that sponsored the last Genocide Olympics in Beijing, lobbied against it. And the same company, during the hearing organized by CECC, will not even acknowledge that China has a human rights problem. The same company quite quickly and comfortably go out to public to criticize our government if something is wrong here. So that gives you an idea how problematic the business community has been. The United States is still one of the largest export destinations for products produced in China. This law is just being implemented. It went into force 3 months ago. Without European countries, Asian countries putting in place similar type of legal mandate, administrative measures, I don't think this is going to be resolved anytime. From what I'm hearing from the business leaders, even more concerning. That includes China Chinese suppliers changing the labels, country of origin, even relocating some of their assembly lines to neighboring countries. And they may transfer Uyghur force slaves to those countries. So something as simple as changing the label from Made in China to PRC could make the consumers to ignore, because we're known to Made in China labels. And now if they change it, or if we change it to Made in Bangladesh, made in Thailand, made in Vietnam, most consumers will not notice it. And then lastly, the consumer community has not been really step up to the plate, as they did in the case of NBC during the Olympic broadcast. There was a NGO effort, worldwide effort to stop watching or not to watch the Olympic game. As a result, the viewership dropped almost 50%. That kind of consumer activism need to be seen. So once the consumers start acting, showing their strengths, this will be heard in the boardrooms, and then it will affect their business practices. So this appeared to be, because this problem has been in the making for almost 2 decades. We're still dancing around. We have not been coherent. We are, we have not even recognized our own ties to the problem. These companies, Chinese suppliers, and some of our own politicians are making us complicit. In the case of climate crisis, economic policies, even development, is a kind of adjunct problem to the CCP's broader national security strategy. They will not do the things because we tone down on human rights and come on board on climate crisis. Or they will not do the things because some politician from our government is begging them to come to the table. It should be the other way around. So we have layers of problems need to be addressed.
Yes, we have the solar panel issue that China's making all the solar panels. So most of the solar panel material comes from China, and much of it possibly, or do you know for a fact that it comes from the forced labor camps?
The solar panel industry, I've talked to the trade association that represents them, rightfully told their members to leave. But it apparently takes time for them to relocate. But what has not been honestly told to the American people is that it takes 10 years for the United States to catch up. This is something that the climate envoy has been telling. It does not. And also we are not in a position to compete with a country that enslaved people and use dirty coal to make solar panels or polysilicon. So we have to be honest with the environmental activists even in this country, or the people, segment of the population who wants to put solar panel on their rooftop to conserve energy.
Right. It's a huge problem. I've been talking long enough. Nury, it can talk. You have much better questions than I do, I'm sure. So I would open it up to questions now.
Thank you. Hi, Nury. My name is Ian McGilvray. I'm from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's new Washington, D.C. branch. So I think you may be aware, our organization has done a lot of work on Xinjiang and the disinformation coming from China, particularly on the Uyghur issue. I just wanted to ask you a question in terms of the disinformation campaign that China's been engaging in. We see Chinese state media using a lot of US social media platforms to propagate a lot of the myths around what's happening in Xinjiang. I was just wondering what you think the solutions are to combating this, particularly from the United States perspective.
You raised a very important point. I was testifying in the US Congress congressional hearing last May. Somebody sent me a screenshot while I was testifying alongside of a camp survivor. The YouTube unleashed a bunch of genocide denial video clips on the right one. So why am I bringing this up? I think the problem is on us. Silicon Valley or tech firms, social media companies. We still don't know if they're taking this seriously. So they're allowing, even if you go to Twitter, the same company ban or put censorship on speech in here, are allowing the Chinese propaganda, namely this person by the name Zhao Lijian, and also the former Global Times editor. He's on social media every day and saying a lot of crazy things, racist things, offensive things. In one instant, the Chinese embassy here in Washington put out a tweet likening Uyghur woman to a baby-making machine. So unless we step up to the plate, two things. Use technological means to filter out the disinformation coming from Beijing. And also we should also need to come up with the kind of a standard approach. Again, this cannot be just one country. What is the standard? Just we need to have a standard like the other industry, automobile industry, for example. We need to have a standard like other global efforts. For example, the FCPA. I make a living by being FCPA lawyer, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. When it was introduced, it was not popular, but now it's a global. If you go to Europe, the same company does business in the United States and Europe follows the same rule. UK has its own anti-bribery provision. Something in that nature need to be put in place. And also, we need to recognize that this regime is desperate. Instead of changing their behavior, they're changing the narrative. For example, Xi Jinping said that this country needs to project a lovable image, and that lovable image will be projected through a disinformation campaign.
Hey, Kelly.
Sorry for being a little bit late, but I wanted to ask about the report that just came out in Geneva. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights just finally, on the last day in office, released her report on the situation in Xinjiang. And it was pretty damning, pretty validating of the things that a lot of us have been saying and that the Chinese government has been denying for the past 6 years. And wondering if you have any thoughts about how that can help to advance the efforts globally and what difference that will make in terms of the countries that to date have not stood up and have not been willing to acknowledge the severity of the situation.
Thank you, Kelly, for the question. I'm glad that you brought it up. It's better than nothing report, I believe. On the positive side, let me start with the positive. It has a UN stamp. It's very important. It does two things. One, will make it impossible, difficult for the members to look the other way. And then two, the Chinese have been blaming the United States that the US is cooking this up and creating this problem. But if the UN recognizes now, I think it will shift some of the focus. Will give a less chance for the Chinese propaganda. On the significance of the report, I was hoping that at least they would call it crimes against humanity, not maybe. The adjective is totally unnecessary. And I would like to, I joined Zaid, the former High Commissioner. He was remarking this week that it should have been just a full genocide. All the elements, as we noted earlier, are there. They should have just went a little bit. And what follows is more important now. I'd like to see a resolution, a binding resolution put in place. And I'd like to see the member states to take action. I'd like to see investigation for the investigation. To this day, the foreign officials, media have been allowed to go, have been only seen the Potemkin villages. They kicked out journalists. In one point, just everyone from the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal were kicked out. So there's no investigative journalism. There's no independent entities, whether it be UN or other, investigating. I hope this will open up. And also finally, Kelly, I'd like to see accountability measures. So how are you going to stop the next atrocities if you don't take an action to stop the ongoing? We know at least 2 ongoing genocide today, the Rohingya genocide and the Uyghur genocide. Talk was cheap. Where is the action? So I'm glad that there's some serious discussions are taking place. We need a leadership, whether here at home or in Europe. Some country needs to step up to the plate and make history, saying things like we need to hold these 2 people account. I'd like to see even tribunal. So how do you hold somebody to account if you don't have a legal mechanism in place?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hello, I'm Komei Suzaki, Japan Chair Fellow at Hudson Institute. I'm sorry for my ignorance of these issues. I have only general knowledge from reporting. My question is, what distinguishes the suppression of Uyghurs in China from other suppression in China, other suppression of minorities like Tibetans? I remember I watched the film 7 Years in Tibet when I was young. I think that describes the nostalgic era of Tibet before the Chinese occupations and perhaps including Chinese aggression as well. What are the differences between the Uyghurs from other minorities in China?
The Chinese constitution and autonomy law, if implemented, would have solved a lot of problems, would have prevented even having a discussion like this. But it has not been implemented. But for the Chinese government, the Uyghur issue is a very serious national security concern. So they're testing. This has been also a testing case for the Chinese. The international community has not shown the type of response that could have stopped this. Now they may implement similar type of practices or policies. In the last couple of years, we have seen increased pressure on Catholic community, removing the cross from the places of worship and putting up Xi Jinping's picture in the church and locking up Catholic leaders. We have seen similar type of behavior in Hui Muslim communities. And recently we've been hearing that the Tibetan community has been subject to DNA collection. So this has not been costly enough for the CCP regime to stop it at the Uyghur, in the Uyghur homeland. So I worry, so if you don't stop this will become a new normal in China, because the CCP has a plan, not only for the Chinese people or the people live within the Chinese proper, they also have a plan for the world.
And I also believe, if I may, it's a scale of the problem. You know, millions of people being forced into labor camps, millions.
Yeah.
And we know that because we had reporters in there chronicling it, and they got kicked out.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I actually learned something new. I've read the book. I'm Marav Sarin. I'm at the House Oversight Committee. You had mentioned the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, which was frustrating to see that though it had been implemented at the end of June, the administration had signed a waiver to allow for countries in Southeast Asia to continue to export solar cells that were coming from Chinese manufacturers in different places, but you had mentioned that China's transporting the actual slave labor community across borders. Are they moving into those 4 countries?
It's highly likely. This is why that we need to have more than the United States to legislate laws, and we need more than people not paying enough attention to, even in a healthy conversation, to advocate within the business community to relocate their businesses out of Central Asia, East Asia countries. that practice may follow with the suppliers. They can still use forced labor.
So the question's a bit leading in the sense that the waiver is very explicit that it is for the ability for us to because the solar industry is just so important in the United States, we need this waiver. But if there's human trafficking happening, then it's not covered. Then it's a waiver that goes beyond the Commerce Department. Where are these? Do you know where these reports might be happening? That if it's from China to or from Xinjiang to it's Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, I believe. Yeah, and Huan.
This is rather a new issue that we're still researching and looking into, but the possibility of using those countries as a country of origin is very real. We've been rightfully focusing Europe, but Europe is not a manufacturing site. Europe is a consumer destination. So, and because of the convenience, logistical convenience to the Chinese, because of those countries' economic reliance on China, it's conceivable that these suppliers, even foreign companies, will relocate and continue this practice.
Any other questions? All the questions. Well, it has been wonderful to be with you tonight and to celebrate this much-needed book. I think every American should read it. It's really eye-opening, gripping, and something that we all need to. We all need to really come to grips with what's happening. It's in some respects we don't. We said that never again with the Holocaust, and it's happening in real time. So thank you so much, Nury.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here.